All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone. Today is our final installment of the Back to School News Literacy webinar series, and I want to say a quick thank you to the Knight Foundation for making this series possible. Today we're going to be joined by two journalists from the Center for Public Integrity, and they're going to be focusing on how they leverage the power of data to investigate inequality in education. I'm Alexa Volland. I'll be moderating this session. I'm a former journalist and fact checker, and I am the Senior Manager of Educator Professional Learning on the Professional Community Learning team. And joined with me behind the scenes is John Silva. He leads the Professional and Community Learning team. He also follows trends in misinformation and conspiracy theory. So if that interests you, you can see his Twitter handle and his email address. Also joined with us behind the scenes from the NLP side is our manager, Liz Price. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A. And if you have any general comments or thoughts, that would be a good place to put them in the chat section. I also want to let you know that the closed captioning is enabled, and the recording and all of the resources from this presentation will be made available to you after the presentation. I also want to say, we don't have a slide, but my colleague Jamie Smith is also behind the scenes, and you might see him dropping any additional resources in the chat. But today we are joined by two journalists. First, Cory Mitchell, who's a senior reporter at the Center for Public Integrity. He writes about racial, gender, and economic equality in education. He is a former associate editor at Education Week. He's also the former Washington correspondent and education reporter for the Star Tribune. We are also joined today by Jamie Smith Hopkins, the editor and senior reporter also at the Center for Public Integrity. She's an investigative journalist that focuses on reporting on the racial wealth gap in the United States. She's also the host of the second season of the Heist podcast and is also a former reporter for the Baltimore Sun. So Cory and Jamie, I will stop sharing my screen and the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm going to share my screen here for a presentation and kick it off to Cory. Oh, and actually, sorry, Alexa, I just realized when I hit share screen that I can't do it. There might be you might be able to enable it.
One moment, we'll get that sorted for you.
In the meantime, I'll just say a couple of things about our newsroom for folks who weren't at the FOIA discussion with our colleague Jennifer LaFleur. We're a nonprofit investigative newsroom based in Washington, D.C., but journalists are all over the country, and we focus on reporting on inequality.
Amazing. I think you should have access now, Jamie.
Great, I will check. There we go. Okay. Cory, can you see the presentation?
No, I cannot. Oh, it's starting now.
Aha, okay, great. Okay. Just kicking this off with some details about how we use data and how we collaborate. We love data. It's a great way to go deeper on stories and help to go beyond and support the anecdotal things we may hear from sources. And when we have situations where we have data about a lot of places, maybe across the country, we'll often look to share with other newsrooms so they can report with us, because inevitably we'll be reporting on maybe a number of places, but never everywhere. There'll be so many stories that you can tell with a data set that might be about, say, every school district in the country or every school. So we'll organize collaborations, invite often local newsrooms to report with us once we've got a data set together that we think would be better for them. And the way we end up doing that is inviting newsrooms that have co-reported with us before or have expressed some interest in the topics that we report on, and just let them know. We'll send out an email to everybody on our list to say, hey, we've got something we think you might be interested in. Join us for a kickoff call. We'll tell you all about it. Let us know if you're interested. And then from there, newsrooms decide how they would like to participate. There may be some times when they feel like this isn't a story for us, or they might decide they'll do something quick, or they may spend weeks and weeks on a story and do a deep dive alongside us. They are also invited to co-publish the story or stories that we write at the same time, but that's not a requirement. So newsrooms get to really define how it is that they're participating. The only thing that we're asking is don't share it before the embargo, so everybody gets a chance to share it together, and just make sure you credit when you do. And kicking this over to Cory for description of a project that we did last year.
Thank you, Jamie. We'll talk for a few minutes here about Criminalizing Kids, a collaboration that we did with US Today, Univision, and several other news organizations last year. Our team analyzed data on student referrals to law enforcement in school and found that on average, more than 200,000 students are referred to law enforcement every school year. We found the consequences of school policing disproportionately fell on students with disabilities, Black children, and in some states, Native American and Latino children. Between 2006 and 2018, schools reporting the presence of at least one security officer on site at least once a week grew from 42% to 61%. And that's not high school, only high schools, that's high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools. So close to 2/3 of schools in this country have some type of law enforcement presence every week. And we think that's important to note because whether school policing works in a school or district is a local issue. And it's still a hotly debated topic in many places. So writing about this issue and bringing data and context to students, administrators, staff, parents, and community members and many of these places across the country can help shape the discourse on whether or not this is a good fit, and also help people evaluate the usefulness of having school police on campus. We can move to the next slide. As I mentioned before, we teamed up with USA Today Network, and also our partners included newsrooms from across the country, from the Midwest, Kansas City and Wisconsin, to the East Coast and Charlotte, and the West Coast and San Diego. Our local partners produced 13 stories, and it allowed them to take a deeper look at what was happening in their individual communities to provide people there a good look at some of the disparities that may have emerged, but also to talk to people about local programs and whether they thought school policing worked in their communities. To help them, we provided a short summary for people who wanted to drop those into their local or regional stories with some of those big data findings on who school policing affects, how often it happens, what states tend to refer more students to law enforcement, what states have problems with disparities in referring more students with disabilities or more Black students or more Native American students. So when we partner with people, we definitely try to provide them information that's useful for them that they can help, so they can help their readers understand the issue at hand. And so, as Jamie mentioned before, go beyond those anecdotes to really look at what's happening in schools or in school districts on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis. We can move to the next slide. And here's a quick look at what our shared data looked like to partners. We have a search tool where you can look up an individual district, an individual school, or even look statewide. And you can go and look at information on the rates of law enforcement referrals per 1,000 students, the number of students referred in a particular demographic. And as you can probably see noted, there are a lot more columns on this thing. Any information that you wanted on law enforcement referrals in schools, like our partners were able to dig up. And sometimes it took like coaching people through the information. But people definitely walked away more informed about what law enforcement was doing on campuses in their school districts or in their state. And it also provides an explainer there on, sort of the caveats to the analysis and some of the things that you can say and can't say based on the numbers. And we also included a much longer media guide, probably like roughly a dozen pages with some frequently asked questions. So people could refer to when they're working on their own. And in addition to that, we also had weekly and sometimes bi-weekly office hours where we invited people in to ask questions about the numbers, but also reporting tips, which we'll jump into a bit later here. We can move on to the next slide.
All right. Before you move on, Jamie, would you mind presenting in the full mode?
Yeah, I've been trying to find out where to do that. I didn't want to mess this up. There's slideshow mode.
Yes, if you could present in slideshow mode, that would be great.
Okay. There we go.
Thank you so much.
Jamie, can we go back to the previous slide for just a moment?
That's the trouble. I don't know how to do this in slideshow mode.
Okay.
Let's see. Hang on. There we go.
Okay. Yeah, that's just a clearer look at what the data that we shared with partners look like. You can see it a little bit more clearly there, but there's just an explanation of everything that's there. And I'm sure that you will have a chance to take a look at this later if you're so inclined. But yeah, a lot of work went into this. Every school district, every state, every school, every charter school in the country was part of this data set. So it's very helpful for anybody who's looking to dig deeper into this topic. Thank you, Jamie. As I mentioned before, we also help partners ask questions about the numbers. There's often a story behind the numbers. And as a reporter, or whether you're someone who's working to advise student journalists or looking to help people understand the process, you sort of take those numbers and you begin to ask questions. You want to know, for instance, how your school or district compares to state and national data. Are they above or below, local and state and national averages? Are there numbers in it that make you ask questions? Are there students with disabilities that are being referred to law enforcement more often in a district or a school? And if so, like, why is that the case? Are there districts that have particularly high or low referral rates? What's driving that? And sometimes those answers may be obvious to some of us. And sometimes there's something that you totally don't expect when you talk to people, activists and school officials and law enforcement agencies at the local level. And another thing that you want to ask if you're talking to people is, are these numbers that we're looking at accurate? Just because they somehow arrive in that form to the federal government doesn't mean that they're always accurate. There's like 14,000 plus school districts in the country. And, most of those districts have multiple schools. So when you have all these numbers coming in to a single government agency, not everything is going to be 100% accurate. So it's always best to ask, hey, we have these numbers. Do these make sense to you? Can you provide context around them? And sometimes that's a great way to get a conversation started, because people start sharing information without you having to, throw questions at them. So move on to the next slide. And just in our own reporting, we asked a lot of questions to try to get at, what the story was. What is the impact of having law enforcement on campus? And we encouraged our partners to do the same. A big question is, what is the process referring students to law enforcement in your community? Some school districts that have law enforcement on campus have agreements with law enforcement agencies called memorandums of understanding. Some of these agreements are designed to prevent schools from referring students for minor incidents and non-criminal behavior. But in some cases, we found students were still being referred to law enforcement for misbehaving in class, something that should have been handled with like proper classroom management or perhaps intervention from a counselor or a social worker or even an administrator. But sometimes when educators become frustrated and there's a law enforcement officer on campus, you think, oh, here's a quick fix to the problem. But one thing that we heard commonly from parents and also advocacy groups is that law enforcement officers are not trained to work with young people. They don't understand brain development, and they don't interact with young people in a way that school staff may be. So sometimes this led to problems. So you want to be just aware of what those relationships between schools and law enforcement look like. You also want to think about common reasons for referral. In the state of Virginia, for example, many students who were doing things like kicking over trash cans or shoving desks when they got upset were being charged with criminal disorderly conduct, which is not a felony, but they could be charged as a misdemeanor. That's a heavy charge for a teenager, or even in some cases younger children to face. You also want to ask if the district has considered changing its relationship with law enforcement and what that looks like. If possible, you want to use open records laws to learn more, ask for discipline records from schools, complaints filed by parents. If you're interested in going to law enforcement agencies, you may want to find out how often they've been called to schools if they don't have officers on campus, because we found in some cases where districts kicked police officers off campus that they were calling in the regular police just as often, if not more, to deal with problems. You also want to find out if families have filed lawsuits against the school or police for in-school or out-of-school incidents and what happened. And a little bit later in this presentation, we'll refer to an actual lawsuit and the outcome. And what we did after all this reporting and how we shared all this information with readers is we had multiple stories at rollout. We also had an explainer on what to expect when your children interact with law enforcement on campus, what rights they have. We also provided a timeline of school policing. It's not a new phenomenon. It's been around for several decades. And in putting together the story, we started with this incident from an elementary school in Philadelphia, where a child was pulled out of class by a school safety officer who took him to a bathroom and screamed at him behind a closed door because the child refused to leave art class after an argument with another student. And we used that incident to segue into our national findings on school policing. And it was just one of many examples that are happening across schools every day. As we mentioned at the start, there's more than 200,000 law enforcement referrals in schools every year. So, there were many incidents, but we thought this particular one in Philadelphia was one that sort of highlighted, how a seemingly, routine thing that happens with children, an argument with a friend or a classmate, sort of escalated into this child being, cornered and berated by an officer. And it's something that probably, required, hey, let's try to work this out, guys. It became a screaming match. And it was of note to us also because the father of the child was an activist in North Philadelphia who had been very critical of the city's law enforcement, not solely on the issue of police and schools, but other matters. So it took somebody who was intimately familiar with law enforcement in that city to paint a picture of how law enforcement seeps not into just all segments of society, including schools. And we can move on to the next slide. Over the next couple of slides, you will see what some of our partners reported. You see there's reference to students in San Diego, Cobb County, Georgia, across North Carolina. And, everybody could take a different piece of the story and make it work for their local audience. You don't have to do a big sweeping story. If you want to focus, if you want to work with students to tell a story in your backyard or your school or your district, you can take that information and make a very compelling piece to bring evidence to bear on these debates over school police. We can move on to the next slide. Here are more examples. I think these are from Wisconsin, and you just take a look here at what they did. This is one of the our partners who did a very deep dive. As you can see, there were multiple stories, and there were actually a couple of news agencies that worked together on these stories. So they frequented office hours, and we had lots of one-on-one meetings with folks to try to talk them through the reporting process, which we thought, was very helpful to us too, because a lot of these partners helped us think about things differently. We weren't always the ones providing answers. Sometimes we were getting answers through their questions. So we can move on to the next slide. And just a little bit more, you see San Antonio here, Kansas City. Not sure about can't remember the middle one there, but these are just some of the examples of what our local partners put together. And, some of them put in, as Jamie mentioned, weeks, some put in days, some just took a look at their numbers and did a local insert. But I think that around these debates, if you can bring information that's more than anecdotal, it's always helpful to readers to help place things into context. We can move on to the next one. What happened next? After reporting, we continue to keep an eye on this issue. It's been roughly a year since publication. In that time, we've written several stories about the ongoing debate over school policing. We really tried to focus in on some student-centered stories in Milwaukee and Denver and other follow-up pieces. And right now, we want to show you a video that shows what an interaction with law enforcement can look like. So Jamie, if you can start the video.
Sorry, folks, it was set up to go, and then it hopped away from it.
Okay, no worries, Jamie.
You got him? You also have a license warrant check. What in the world? Yeah. Trying to hide behind the car. Ready. That's him. Get in. Now. I'm not asking. Get in the car.
I'm going with you. Let's go.
Oh, we're going to have problems. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. You better stop. You better cut. I don't care. You don't make that decision for yourself.
Let's take a clipboard.
Fit what? Is he special needs? Yeah, he does. Probably not.
Does your mama spank you? She is today. She will spank you today because we're going to call her and tell her exactly what's going on. She's going to spank you today. I'm going to ask her if I can do it.
Yeah, thank you. Jamie, wanted to show that video, and I'm sorry, I should have offered a word of warning that that could be distressing for some people there. But there's a number of reasons that we wanted to show that. It shows what a simple interaction between law enforcement and a student could end up looking like. On the surface, if you hear, okay, a student walked away from school, a police officer was there solely to assist in getting the student back to school, that's a lot different than what we just saw. And it's an example of how news organizations pushing for information can change the perception of an incident. People started asking questions about this, and not us. There were other news organizations started asking questions about this. So the law enforcement agency in Montgomery County, Maryland, made this video public so people can see what happened, and it really shaped how people viewed this incident. Yeah, so when you hear, you pick up a 5-year-old who walked away from school, you don't anticipate that. And that's why it's important for, to ask for documentation or footage of events, because sometimes what you hear from a school district, from a law enforcement agency, is much different than what actually happened. I won't say always, but there are instances. Um, so this happened in January 2020, just before schools began to shut down before the pandemic. And then a few weeks ago, the Montgomery County, Maryland, agreed to pay out a $275,000 settlement to the family of this child. And this was roughly 90 seconds of a 51-minute video. The part that we show you was by far not the worst, but it's just an example of how these interactions with police can go wrong, and how a single um, data point, can really paint a picture of what's happening with schools and law enforcement. Because if you look at data from the 1920 school year, you may see that as one law enforcement referral, but that's, an example of what could happen. Not every incident is like that, but that's why it makes sense to dig and to ask questions. And we can move to the next slide. And Jamie, I'll turn it over to you for this one.
Thanks, Cory. And thanks very much for going over that project from last year. What we're working on right now, and Cory is working on this with another reporter in the newsroom, is called Unhoused and Undercounted. It's ongoing, so it has not been published yet. What we're doing is analyzing federal data that tracks the number of homeless students reported by each school district. And unlike, say, with HUD counts, where homelessness has a very specific definition, schools are defining this differently. The Department of Education defines this differently. It's based on federal law, and it includes students who are doubled up with relatives or friends for economic reasons, in addition to those who are living in motels or shelters or vehicles or out in the open. And so it's a fairly broad definition that really gets at housing instability. And we're sharing this data with newsrooms around the country with an aim to publish this fall. What we're finding so far is that many districts are reporting far fewer homeless students than they likely have, based on measures of need like poverty rates and free and reduced lunches. This is something that experts and advocates speak to in terms of, long history of likely undercounting. There are, I believe it's state of Florida, for instance, has kind of a rule of thumb in terms of if you have so many students eligible for free and reduced lunch, what percentage of those would you expect need to be counted as housing unstable? That if you're falling below that measure, you're probably missing them. So really what this project was aiming to do is to get at that question nationally, to get at this issue of undercounting that advocates have said has been a long problem. And the reason for this is because this is not just a matter of accounting. This is not just a matter of numbers. That federal law requires that schools provide these housing and students with housing instability more help, and that you can't do that if you haven't identified them. So really, these numbers speak to that crucial first step. And the reason that the law requires this extra help, the reason that experts say extra help is needed, is because it's much harder for homeless students to graduate. And when schools don't provide the extra help to make sure they're able to get to that finish line, that the consequences can ripple for a really long time. Cory, I can't actually see the notes at the bottom, so I may be talking where you're supposed to. Do you want to take this one?
Sure, and just for just a little bit more before we move here, a little bit more context around this. For the participants on the call, once we make this information available to this data available to everyone, it could be of interest to you and the students that you work with, or that you sort of coach through these issues, because they're likely students in your schools who are bouncing from home to home, who technically have a place to sleep at night, but who are entitled to extra support under federal law. And some of those rights include transportation to and from school, the right to remain enrolled in the same school and district if they move, and support to ensure that they can participate in after school and other extracurricular activities just like their peers. So as Jamie mentioned, large part of the federal law around student homelessness is to help these students have some stability when they're experiencing housing instability. And it is very important to note this because, this being more likely to perhaps drop out of school or struggle in school isn't something that's just limited to students who experience homelessness in high school. Researchers have documented that these risks are experienced for children who are housing unstable anytime during the K-12 experience. If they were homeless for a while in elementary school, that kind of reverberates throughout their existence. And that's why there's a need for these extra supports. And while we're trying to go to places around the country and pinpoint where there are perhaps undercounts, but also some of the disparities that exist, certain types of students experiencing homeless more often, and whether school districts have developed programs to help support these students. And this is where we get to the data. My colleague, Amy, put together just a wealth of options for our potential partners and our partners and potential partners that show homelessness rates across the country. And these maps give you a view. This is the Bay Area of California. You can take a look. Some of these districts have very high homeless rates next to districts that have virtually non-existent rates. So they may raise questions about, what's at play here. Is it income inequality? Is it some larger, housing issue? Or perhaps is the school district not doing a good job of identifying students who may be experiencing, housing instability? Because you see some of the darker blue circles, which indicates that homelessness is in the neighborhood of 10% plus, and then you see some where it's virtually zero. And just based on what we know about homelessness and that definition of folks being between places, having a place to sleep and not being in a shelter or on the streets or in the car, but having to rely on the kindness of others or relatives, it makes it very unlikely that all of these places have virtually no homeless students. So we can move to the next slide. And she also put together these scatter graphs that show different places around the country. If you look here, you look for the outlier up top. This is a district that doesn't have a high poverty rate, as you can see from the bottom of the axis. It's south of 10%, but the number of homeless students is off the charts almost. And you ask yourself why. This is the Monte Rio Union Elementary School districts. It's one of the districts impacted by the Kincaid fire. And as we will point out in our reporting, that sometimes homelessness isn't just caused by a loss of employment or falling on hard times. When you start thinking about climate change and natural disasters, those things can also affect students and their ability to be housed and have a stable place to sleep at night and have access to many other things like water and food. So when looking through data, we try to look carefully for things that are outliers or seem to be out of order, to ask questions about what else is at play. When you start talking about homelessness and housing instability and then how that affects children, it all comes together, and it helps out to just really think about how broad this issue is. Can go on to the next slide. And I'm going to turn this back over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Cory. So as we mentioned, we're in the midst of this, actually reporting this, so we're having these conversations with partners. So thinking through other sources of information they could find to include in their stories, and of course we're thinking through this ourselves, because this is just a starting point. As robust and really telling as this data is, it's just a starting point. So that could be in addition to just calling people and talking to them and asking for context in that way. reporters could look for state databases that their state might maintain a database that has subcategories tracking homeless students' academic achievement, graduation rates, other sort of measures that get at are there disparities there? How are districts doing? Are some districts, do they seem to have found a model of success that other districts might want to look at? The question of capacity for homeless student liaisons that are designated by school districts to actually make sure that the requirements of federal law are implemented. Because asking this question of what capacity they have is important, because often they're not doing this full time. They're doing a variety of other things in addition to this responsibility. So it's this question of, do they have the time and the resources to fulfill these duties? Particularly because in some cases, a school or a school district might decide to go above and beyond, to make sure that they're able to do more. The question of how school districts ask, how they actually ask families, are you homeless under this definition? Do you need these services? This could vary quite a bit from place to place because there aren't strict standards. So better understanding how is your school district asking? How are other school districts asking? Is the question itself helping to get this information, or maybe making it less likely a family is going to feel comfortable saying yes? And then the question of costs. How much are districts spending to serve homeless students? How are they funding it? Do they have adequate funding? Do they see the funding fluctuates a lot year by year? All these things can help create a better picture of what's happening and why. And Cory, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point around the housing questionnaires. Districts, schools are required to have these questionnaires, and if they don't, the responsibility for identifying these students falls on the shoulders of teachers and counselors and social workers and other staff. And you may be looking at some of the markers of a student who may be experiencing housing instability, more frequent absences, soiled clothing, falling asleep in class. But there will be cases where some of these students are able to mask those things. But that doesn't mean that they don't still need support, or they can benefit from having that transportation to ensure that they get to and from school daily, or that they don't need someone to advise them and their family on potential emergency housing options. So as Jamie pointed out, those school enrollment questionnaires and whether or not districts are actually going out and asking families and ensuring that if they need support that they can get it, that's crucial for people who work directly with young people to be able to understand when they're eligible for support and whether or not they're being made aware that that support is available. And that wraps the prepared slides that we have for the presentation. I mean, we could introduce some questions to get a conversation started, but before we do that, we would like to field questions if there are any from participants.
I see a question from Sandy asking if there's a link to the site the data came from. In the case of the story about homeless students, it hasn't been published yet, the analysis obviously, but this comes from federal data, Department of Education data, and some other sources like census. That's something that we can share afterward if for anybody who would like to get that. And in the case of Criminalizing Kids, the first project, some of that data is visible with the story. I think a link was shared, but again, that comes directly from the Department of Education.
All right, thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone to please use that Q&A feature. I have a couple questions to kind of get us started. Before I do that, I'm just going to reshare my screen one more time. Perfect. So the Criminalizing Kids series is just really incredible work. Throughout the reporting on that, I'm curious, like, what during that reporting process did you find to be the most surprising, Cory?
Just the overall number of law enforcement and for referrals every school year. And just to clarify, a law enforcement referral does not mean that there was an arrest or charges made, but that happened often. And in some cases, it could lead to a court referral or a citation. Know that ProPublica published a series of stories earlier this year where they focused solely on the state of Illinois and looked at the number of citations that were issued to students, often to families who could not afford to pay these fines and the repercussions of those actions. These law enforcement referrals are widespread and in even some cases not completely documented. We found in some cases, some of the nation's largest districts, New York City, for example, Pittsburgh, and some other large districts that reported no law enforcement referrals. But when you go in and look at state numbers or you request records on police dispatches to schools, I mean, you see hundreds and hundreds. So the number is large, but it's almost certainly an underestimate. And to just think that, there are these many young people every year coming into contact with law enforcement. And, from you think about high schoolers, but the video we showed you was a 5-year-old. I have young children myself, and to think that, this could be my children on the other end of an interaction with law enforcement is quite unsettling. Not every situation is like this. Some are perhaps more cordial, and we encounter some people who have a very, different approach to school policing. But just the sheer number was quite shocking to me.
Yeah, I can imagine. So on this webinar is mostly made up of teachers, and I really appreciate you kind of putting some of these stories and questions into context, things that they could use into practice. I'm curious, what would you say are the basics that should be emphasized with students who are learning about investigative process or investigative reporting?
I'll say something quick, but I'll turn it over to Jamie, since she's been at this a lot longer than I have. But I would just say that young people have to trust their instincts. If they think that something is a story, try to dig into it and find out if there's something there. Find out if there's some numbers, some data that can take you beyond the anecdotes. But what us adults and seasoned reporters often struggle with is connecting with people who are affected by our reporting, but also understanding what people are most concerned about. And this issue of school policing has been an issue for decades, but it really didn't rise to the national consciousness until some of the deadly mass shootings in the 1990s. Had probably been many of the issues that we reported on were probably surfaced in the 70s and 80s. But it took these incidents and people having questions about the role of police on campus and whether they can prevent shootings and what role they play in preventing shootings and protecting students versus situations where you feel like the students need protection from the police. So I would just advise young people to trust their instincts. If they think something is worth going after, to give it a shot. And if your administration is encouraging you that it's not a big deal, maybe you should dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. Because I can't tell you how many times we've heard, I don't think there's ever a time when we've done an investigation where we haven't heard from somebody, there's nothing to see here. This is no big deal. That's like, you always hear that. And so following your instincts and asking questions, and pressing that's all a good thing to do. And because as student journalists, because you're there in the schools, you have access to other students and teachers in a way that people outside the schools just don't. It means that you likely will have access to information that really nobody else has. And so like using that and trusting your instinct, I think is really important.
And just one more point. This may be going a little bit into the weeds. and something that's a little bit harder to pull off. But if you're in a school and you notice incidents where you think that perhaps a law enforcement officer is not following policy on or something, it could be just as simple as requesting from the district, when are officers supposed to interact with students, when are they not? When does a memorandum of understanding say that they can step in to restrain a student or something along those lines? Because what we found in talking to many activists and reviewing cases is that there are these memorandums of understanding, and there's supposed to be this sort of separation between what schools can handle and what law enforcement can handle. But in many cases, school officials are, when they're on site, police are on site, they're just deferring to police. They just come in and take over. So, I mean, there's just many ways that if you wanted to approach this as a student journalist to really take a look at it and start asking questions.
Yeah, I love that. I believe earlier in the presentation, you had a slide focused on context. And we know that data without context can be used to tell any number of stories, and data without context can also be used to perpetuate negative stereotypes. So can you talk a little bit about kind of your method for contextualizing all of this data, especially when there's so much of it?
And this is a case where having national data is important. You may take a zero in one place and things look relatively stable. There are no disparities in students who are referred to law enforcement. But if you begin to take a national picture, you can't explain away some of these things that exist. Students with disabilities, and that's not solely restricted to physical disabilities. It may be students with emotional disabilities or intellectual disabilities. They just have more law enforcement referrals. It could point to an issue around law enforcement officers not understanding how to work with these students, but also it could point to an issue with educators not understanding how to work with these students and sort of falling back on law enforcement. Because it's easy to think, okay, well, these students have disabilities, they're acting out. In some cases that may be going on, but when you step back and you talk to people who represent families in these cases, sometimes there's a child has a plan approved with the school that says, okay, if a child is having a hard time, you take these 3 steps to help them adjust. And if you bypass that and go to law enforcement, it's important to know that. And that's would seem to be the case in some of these referrals to law enforcement. And you could turn some of the numbers on their head if you so choose to say, well, if these types of students are being referred to law enforcement more often, well, it must be the case that they're just troublemakers. But I mean, we found these racial disparities in places where there are very few Black and Latino students in states, such as Maine and New Hampshire. We found, these wide disparities, which could make the case that these students are being targeted by law enforcement. So, I mean, the context is important, looking at, comparing district numbers to state numbers to national numbers to see if there are any anomalies, but also going out and talking to people as part of the reporting process to help you better understand. We tackle this as a reporting project, but there are attorneys and other advocates who have worked on these issues for years who can say, okay, this is what the landscape looks like in my part of the country, or looks like nationally. This is what you need to understand. When you talk to a superintendent or a police chief in this place, they're going to say these 3 things. 2 of these are true and totally accurate. The third, I'm not so sure. So talking to people to develop a better understanding is always important in reporting, especially enterprise and investigative reporting. When you have more time to put a story together. If someone just wrote out these numbers and said, hey, write this story, you get a much different account of what's happened. So that context is important.
Yeah, that's very true. I wanted to highlight for anyone who is working with student journalists who might be interested in digging into this, that besides sharing the story with them so they can see sort of how we approached it, there's a link in a box in the story. I also dropped the link in the chat that gets you right to our media kit. And so then you see what the partners saw. You have access to the data, you have a lot of context and questions you might want to ask, other things you can look for. And so hopefully that would be helpful to student journalists. It's because the data that gets reported is always several years behind. And this is a story that came out last year. We are talking about, is it 2017, 2018 school year data, Cory? Yeah. But that's not that long ago. And so I think even now that could really help a student journalist trying to maybe bring some context to a particular incident that they're reporting on, say.
Yeah.
There's often a lag in data reporting at the federal level, just because you have to amass those numbers from so many school districts and so many states. But I mean, there is more current data available now if you or students you work with are interested in taking a look.
Yep, and get in touch with us. There's, I believe there's still contact information on the media kit, and you can contact us through our website too, if you're interested in going deeper.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that. I think this will be our last question, unless anything kind of pops into the Q&A box. But for a lot of students, their understanding of what investigative journalists do or how they do their job is shaped from movies like Spotlight or from seeing the film All the President's Men in school. So I'm curious, what are some maybe Hollywood misconceptions about the role of investigative journalists, and what would you like teachers, how would you suggest that they describe the role of investigative journalism?
I'll let Jamie take the first crack at this.
My personal sense, and I also heard this from the journalists, is that people really like Spotlight. Journalists really like Spotlight because it is a very accurate representation of what does this work like, which is that it's a slog and you constantly questioning whether you're getting it right, and you want to do 10,000 more interviews and you're worried, that's a good movie to show. Also very accurate in the clothing journalists wear.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. Although for what it's worth, All the President's Men is the movie that made me want to be a reporter as a kid. So it is inspiring. Yeah, it's a slog. And so understanding that that's part of the process, and you want to be asking questions about, am I thinking about this right? And what am I missing? And talking to more people and, getting them to try to poke holes, because you want to have all those conversations before the story's out. Let people poke holes first to make sure you got it right.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to explain when I'm in conversation with someone, they ask what I do. I try to use the explain before I say I'm a reporter. I try to avoid saying investigative because they get all types of misconceptions about what it is that we actually do. But I try to explain it. We research issues and we try to write about things that should matter to people. Because when you say investigative reporter, people often say, well, are people giving you secret documents? And I'm just like, no one's really giving me any documents. Like, I have to request those, and it can take weeks and months for those to come back. Nobody's giving me anything in sealed manila envelopes. Well, maybe some people are, but not me. But yeah, it's just, I try to explain to people that, especially at the Center for Public Integrity, that we're focused on reporting on an inequality in the United States. The people who are well heeled in this country are very well served by government. They don't face many of the problems that many of us do. They don't have to worry about issues of environmental quality and disproportionate school policing and wealth gaps and things of those nature. So we just really try to focus on questions that matter to people, that can perhaps affect change in people's lives. And yeah, I'm not showing up at press conferences, shoving microphones in people's faces. As far as like, I would guess Spotlight is probably the best, even though it's probably the best representation of what investigative reporters do on a daily basis. But yeah, it's complicated, and I'm a relative newbie at this, so I'm still learning. I can't offer anyone like this end all be all guidance, but just people who want to ask questions and are persistent in getting answers is probably the best answer that I can give.
Well, Jamie and Cory, I just want to thank you again so much for joining us today and sharing your insight and expertise. For our participants today, I want to share our survey. Your feedback is really, really valuable to us. So please take the time to let us know what you thought of this session. If this is the first session that you attended in the 6-part webinar, you're in luck, because if you've registered for this one, you have access to all of the previous sessions, as well as our first session with Jennifer LaFleur, also from the Center for Public Integrity. But Jamie and Cory, thanks so much. I believe we've also dropped some of your contact information in the chat, but anything else that you want to kind of end on?
I just wanted to thank, I think it's Sandy. Yes, thank you, Sandy, for pointing out that the links to the full data sets seem to not be working. I'm going to go back and figure out what happened with that. Sometimes the problem of a project that's a year old is links die. So I really appreciate it. We'll see what's going on and fix that.
All right. Again, thank you so much for joining. It was been such a pleasure talking and hearing about these projects that you're working on. Have a great rest of your night.